President Donald Trump plans to, but it's up to him to confirm it, to organize discussions in the next few hours or days with the Russians to clarify what happened and try to move forward. Furthermore, the Russians have promised to get back to the Ukrainian side on the proposals that have been made during the discussions yesterday and this morning. So at this stage, we need to be cautious. Secondly, we are consistent in saying that if the answer to a ceasefire remains negative, we will need to respond and therefore we will need to step up the sanctions. They are currently being worked on between the Europeans and the Americans. So it would be too early here to go into the details.
Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky met with US Vice President J.D. Vance. US President Trump called Vladimir Putin again. Meanwhile, Russian dictator Putin decided to continue the war against Ukraine. So what did President Zelensky discuss with J.D. Vance in Vatican, and why does Vladimir Putin want to continue his war against Ukraine? Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met in Vatican this weekend with US Vice President J.D. Vance and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. So this meeting was conducted for the first time after that disastrous meeting in the Oval Office in February this year, when J.D. Vance attacked President Zelensky publicly before and after this press conference with the American media. So both President Zelensky and J.D. Vance had a great and good meeting, according to Ukrainian presidency. Moreover, both leaders discussed the negotiations with Russia. President Zelensky told J.D. Vance that Russia was also suggesting and demanding unrealistic concessions from the Ukrainians, and Zelensky told J.D. Vance that Russia rejected this 30-day ceasefire offer from U.S. President Donald Trump and other European allies. Moreover, both sides talked about achieving peace in Ukraine. As we know, European allies issued an ultimatum with unified ultimatum of European allies, and US President Donald Trump has been issued to Vladimir Putin to impose 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine. After that, Vladimir Putin rejected this offer. Instead, he suggested to continue conducting this direct negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian delegation. After that, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky invited Vladimir Putin to conduct a personal one-on-one meeting in Istanbul. However, Vladimir Putin didn't show up. Moreover, he sent a low-level delegation to Istanbul to conduct negotiations with the Ukrainians. And according to Sky News and other media and other European media outlets, Russian delegation has demanded unrealistic concessions from the Ukrainian delegation during this negotiations in Istanbul. So Russian side demanded Ukrainian armed forces to withdraw from the 4 Ukrainian regions which are not fully occupied by Russia, which are Ukrainian. Russia has captured the part of those regions. However, Russia does not control whole 4 regions. Despite this fact, Russia is demanding Ukrainian armed forces to withdraw from all 4 regions of Ukraine, also from that part of regions which are not even occupied by the Russian side. Also, Russia threatened to continue the war against Ukraine for 20 years, as it was with Sweden, and also there were other demands, unrealistic demands from Russian side. So President Zelensky told J.D. Vance that there was a need to impose sanctions and inflict pain on Vladimir Putin to force him to sit at the negotiating table, because Russian delegation right now is demanding from Ukraine unrealistic concessions. Russia is not ready for a compromise. Putin is not ready for a compromise because he is not ready to make any kind of compromise. His aims and his demands are the same, which were 3 years ago when he began his illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, US President Donald Trump is calling Vladimir Putin again. Trump doesn't understand why Vladimir Putin still continues the war against Ukraine. So as we know, US President Donald Trump is again putting diplomatic effort to end this war in Ukraine, calling both Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky to call the end of the war in Ukraine. However, European officials and Ukrainian officials are trying to persuade Trump to put pressure on Putin. The real message is you need to inflict more pain on Vladimir Putin. You need to put pressure on Putin to force him to sit at the negotiating table. Instead, he will only issue unrealistic ultimatums, unrealistic demands, and not will be able to make any kind of a deal. So without pressure, it is impossible to deal with Russia because, as many military experts say and suggest, Russia understands only power and military strength. That's why US President Trump should inflict more pain on Russia, should impose sanctions on Russian oil and Russian economy to force Vladimir Putin to agree with sustainable ceasefire deal, because Vladimir Putin has been humiliating Trump for many weeks by refusing to agree with his 30-day ceasefire proposal. He just suggested and proposed to conduct direct negotiations with Ukrainians, but during these negotiations, Russia has been just issuing another unrealistic ultimatums, unrealistic demands to withdraw from Ukrainian territories. They asked Ukrainian forces to withdraw from its own territories. Moreover, they have rejected Trump's plan to end the war in Ukraine. They don't want to freeze the war at the current front lines, despite previous conversation between Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump. So according to Reuters, European leaders, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and French President Emmanuel Macron have conducted a unified call, have conducted a phone call with US President Donald Trump before his telephone conversation with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, and they are trying to convince Trump that Putin is just taping him along, is just playing games with him, is just pretending to he's just pretending to be open to a ceasefire deal. However, he just still is buying enough time. He's buying his army time to capture more Ukrainian land while pretending to be open to this ceasefire deal, ceasefire negotiations. That's why European leaders have conducted another round of a phone call with US President Donald Trump, and that's what British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said to the whole European audience. So British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is also making another ultimatum to Vladimir Putin. He's just saying, stop, Vladimir, or you will face another round of sanctions on your Russian economy, which is already in free fall because there are lots of problems with Russian economy. So here, what UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is making this ultimatum to Vladimir Putin and is trying to convince Putin to back down on Ukraine and to agree with a full and unconditional ceasefire right now.
And obviously, our most urgent challenge here today is securing a just and lasting peace for Ukraine, a just and lasting peace. Those words, just and lasting, being so important. And that is why it's vital that we all step up to do more for our own defence. And last week I announced a major package of sanctions on the Russian shadow fleet, ramping up the pressure on Putin and protecting our critical infrastructure.
Vize uygulamalarının da gözden geçirilmesi.
And supported by President Trump, the argument about an unconditional ceasefire, that Putin must come to the table for that unconditional ceasefire, and to issue, as we did last weekend, that ultimatum. Now, having issued that ultimatum, we must be prepared to follow through, because if Russia won't come to the negotiating table, Putin must pay the price. And I think yesterday, as already been mentioned, was further evidence that Putin is not serious about peace. Russia is dragging its feet and playing games, whilst Ukraine has shown itself to be the party of peace.
Meanwhile, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer had a phone call with US President Donald Trump, but Russian dictator Vladimir Putin still believes that he can win this war. He is confident that his army can capture more Ukrainian land until the end of this year. So according to Bloomberg, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin still believes that he can win this war. He believes that his army can capture the 4 regions of Ukraine Russia has previously annexed even before the end of this year, according to the Bloomberg's intelligence sources. So Vladimir Putin still believes in these unrealistic aims because many military experts are confident that Russia cannot cannot capture this whole 4 regions of Ukraine. They cannot simply cross the Dnipro River. They cannot capture Kherson. Previously, the Russian army was forced to withdraw from the city of Kherson, and it's really impossible for the Russian army right now, according to the military analysts, to capture the city of Kherson or the city of Zaporizhia. So Vladimir Putin is pursuing his unrealistic aims. However, according to Bloomberg, there are some people in Russia's Ministry of Defense who understand the real situation and understand that it would be really impossible for Russian side to capture the whole 4 regions of Ukraine because of the strong Ukrainian defense posture there and lots of minefields and Ukrainian drones which are killing Russian soldiers on the daily basis. And they're trying to do this as much as possible. That's why this aim is so unrealistic. On the other hand, according to the Washington Post, Russian senior military commanders and soldiers would like to capture the whole 4 regions of Ukraine and really they don't support a ceasefire deal. That's why Vladimir Putin faces difficult situation, because if he agrees, some military experts are confident that if Putin agrees to a full ceasefire in Ukraine right now, his own hardliners, military leaders, could topple his regime because of the price he has already sacrificed in this war. On the other hand, if Vladimir Putin doesn't accept any kind of a ceasefire, his economy will be ruined by the Western sanctions. He will continue to suffer these unsustainable losses, and according to the UK military intelligence, Russia will lose approximately 1 million people died and wounded in this conflict until the start of this summer. That's why Vladimir Putin is a cornered rat right now, because he faces such difficult situation, and it is only his responsibility. He is the author of his fate, and he is a responsible person for this situation in which he is right now. That's why European leaders are trying to impose more pressure on Vladimir Putin to force him to agree with this 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine. If he declines this offer, then European allies are ready to impose sanctions on Russia and also to impose another pain on Russian economy, which is in a free fall right now. Meanwhile, US Vice President J.D. Vance have already met with the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and head of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen. Leaders discussed current affairs between EU and the American administration. So J.D. Vance in Italy also met with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and Ursula von der Leyen, head of the European Commission. They discussed current affairs and current state of affairs between EU and United States of America. They discussed trade and the war in Ukraine. And now you can hear what J.D. Vance, Ursula von der Leyen said before the beginning of these high-stakes negotiations right now, in this time when Donald Trump is threatening another tariffs against all countries of the world. And this is really important high-stakes negotiation right now in this time when the global trade war is on edge right now.
The people of Italy have been most gracious, especially today, which was a beautiful ceremony, and all credit goes to the Vatican, but of course your government for making it possible for so many foreign leaders to come in and celebrate Pope Leo's inaugural Mass. Of course, an American Pope. The United States is very proud of him, very thrilled with him, and certainly our prayers go with him as he starts this very important work. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think one of the things that Prime Minister Meloni has offered to do, and of course the President and I are excited to accept, is really to be a bridge builder, I think, in some ways, between Europe and the United States. I've said repeatedly that I think, Europe is an important ally of the United States. The individual countries within Europe are important allies of the United States.
And that's all for today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and